All right, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started for today. I think everyone who RSVP'd is here. So we're not missing anybody as far as I know. So thank you all for being here. Today we're gonna talk about Irish immigrants in Iowa. Since it's March and with St. Patrick's Day, I thought it would be a good theme for us. The upcoming Lunch and Learns, in April, Dean Jacobson and Alan Johnson from Northwest Bank will be guest speaking. Not quite sure what their topic is yet. They're going to tell me later this week, so if you follow us on Facebook or check our website, it'll be up there by the end of the week. In May, we're going to talk about wedding season in Iowa, as that's kind of the beginning of wedding season. And then in June, we're going to have another guest speaker, Jenna Keene from Iowa State University's Outreach. She's in charge of 4-H, so she's going to give us the history of 4-H in general and kind of the accomplishments of 4-H in Iowa and in Clay County. Yes. All right, so today's object is a glass potato. It's over here, so you can take a closer look at it after the program. It is one of the few things that came up when I searched our collection for Irish, and we'll kind of talk about why that is towards the end. But it's made of Galway glass. It's a crystal paperweight that was donated by Walter Keating. He probably picked it up in his travels. We're not really sure when he got it. But yeah, if you take a look at it closely, you can see like the divots. It looks like a potato. And I thought it was kind of fun and interesting, and I don't know when else we would show off our glass potato. All right, so we'll get right into it. We're going to start with why Irish immigrants came to the United States and to Iowa. So there were three main push factors, things that were happening in Ireland that were pushing them out. The first one is limited resources. The Potato Famine happened in the 1840s. That was a really, really big push. There wasn't enough food for everybody, so it was either really move or you would starve. Just to kind of give some numbers for that, to put it in perspective, Irish immigrants made up half of all immigrants in the 1840s to the United States. And then from 1841 to 1891, so in 50 years, the population dropped in Ireland from 8.2 million to 4.7 million, which is almost half as many. So that's a pretty big decrease. And so those people either moved out of Ireland or they died because of the famine. There was also religious repression. Most of the Irish were Catholics, and they were part of the British Empire, who did not like Catholics. So it was hard for them to practice their faith and establish churches and parishes so they could practice. And so that was a really big push. They wanted to move somewhere where they could openly be Catholic. There was also just a lack of opportunities, right? There wasn't any class mobilities. If you were born a poor farmer, you stayed a poor farmer. And this was for a couple of reasons. One, they couldn't buy more land. Land was limited. You got what you got. And generally, if it was for sale, you couldn't afford it. And generally, you worked somebody else's land to earn your wages. You didn't really make money off of your own. And there was also limited education because of this, too. The rural population of Ireland didn't get educated, which means they couldn't get a job better than being a farmhand. And because they were stuck as a farmhand, they also couldn't learn new skills to be a blacksmith or a cobbler. They really had to stay on their family farms. And there were a lot more push factors to me pull factors than push factors. And the big thing was positive reports from others. So friends and family would write to their friends and family in Ireland telling them how great it was here or how much better it was than Ireland. The priests and bishops were a big part of reporting how great Iowa was to others. They saw the Potato Famine as this opportunity to move the Irish Catholic community from Ireland to Iowa specifically, and just to the United States as a whole. So they brought over monks and nuns from Ireland. They generally would go to a big city, and then they would be asked to come to Iowa to work at some parish. So they would travel that way. Religious leaders were also writing to Catholic newspapers and writing to priests in Ireland, telling them how great it is over here and how much opportunity. They could have land, they could farm, they could work at a store, they could do all these things here that they couldn't do in Ireland. They even made pamphlets. There were I think there were 3 full pamphlets about why immigrants should come to America, that were produced in Ireland. So it was really widespread. One of those, this is an ad for the Iowa, which was a steamship that was created to bring immigrants over from Ireland to New Orleans, is where it would first enter America, and then it would travel up the Mississippi. A lot of people got off at New Orleans or at a different city along the way up the Mississippi, but a lot of them did end up in Iowa and went all the way to Dubuque or Burlington and got off and settled there. And so that's just kind of one example of how people got here. Again, there were more economic opportunities in America and in Iowa. Many came over and they started working as day laborers in the city. So they would earn money that they could then buy a farm, or they would earn money to get a better house and better their lives. And they were able to do this. They had an advantage over other immigrants because they spoke English. They could understand their orders a lot better than other people. And so that did give them a slight advantage over the German or the French immigrants, right? They spoke the language already. They also had an understanding of how American politics worked, so they were able to use that to their advantage when they made up the majority of a city. And then there was this chance to own land, or own more land anyways. They could have a farm that they actually made money off of rather than they just grow their own food and then they went and worked on someone else's land. They could have their own farm. And there were multiple ways they could do this. Again, they could work as a laborer in a city, get enough money to buy land. The government was kind of handing away land in Iowa for a while to anybody who would want it, so they got it that way, just purchasing it very cheaply from the US government. Especially before Iowa became a state, that was a big thing. Also, if they served in the Civil War, land was awarded. If they worked on the railroads, they could buy land from the railroad companies. So it was there were a lot of different ways they could go about it. And just some more numbers. From the 1820s through the Civil War, the Irish made up of a third of all immigrants. And then in the 1840s, they were half of all immigrants. So they still made up a large chunk of the immigrants coming to the United States in the 1800s. And then from 1800 to the Potato Famine in 1840, it was mostly single men that came over, right? It was kind of that chain migration where the men would come over, get set up, and then they would send for their families. The Potato Famine kind of threw a wrench in that. So when the Potato Famine happened in the 1840s, families just came all together. They didn't try and send someone off to establish a home first. They just got out of there and came over here. All right, and then once they got here, again, many had farms. And the way that land was advertised, the weather and environment in Iowa isn't the same as Ireland. It was the same as Germany, so a lot of Germans came over because they were told it's just like Germany. That wasn't the case with the Irish. They were told about the soil quality, and they were told about how easily crops grew, which wasn't happening in Ireland anymore, right? The potatoes weren't growing. And so a lot of people would write and say, our potato crop came in so easily with little work, and that was the big draw. So it was more about the quality of work than the environment itself. The first laborers that actually came over to Iowa were in the 1820s, 1830s, and they came over for the lead mines in Dubuque. And that was before Iowa was a state. So at that point, that territory was technically property, according to the US government, of a Native American chief, Chief Blackhawk. And so them crossing the river to come work in these lead mines was highly illegal. And they were getting in big trouble. Some of them were killed for this coming over. Eventually, things worked out in their favor that they got to stay over and build Dubuque and Burlington and Davenport, those larger cities. And a lot of them got rich off the lead mines, and that's why those cities were able to build and prosper. So that's what kind of the first ones. The next big group of laborers were railroad workers. A lot of the sources I read while I was researching this said that the Irish built the railroads in Iowa. So it's thanks to them that we have railroads. And I think that's pretty true. A lot of them, there were multiple railroad companies that were competing with each other to try and get the most rails in Iowa, the most tracks laid. So they would hire large groups of Irish men who would lay the tracks and just work their way, north to south or east to west, and just kind of lay the tracks that way. A lot of them, some of them would go on and keep building tracks towards the west coast. They would keep following that company. Some of them would settle wherever the tracks stopped, and they would build their family there. And then some of them were able to purchase land from the railroad companies. The railroad companies were given land by the government, and they were given a lot of land, much more land than a railroad track takes up. So once the tracks were built, they didn't want that excess land, and so they sold it to their workers at like a discount rate. All right. What does this have to deal with Clay County? There weren't Irish here. So I said earlier that our glass potato over here was one of 3 things that came up when I searched our system, the word Irish. And that tells me that there weren't Irish here. And if you know that Catholics and Protestants don't get along, that means that there were Protestants here and not Catholics. So while there were Irish communities in every city, they had like mini Irelands everywhere, and they did get to small towns, but it was kind of a first come, first serve. Whoever settled first, they got that spot. So German Protestants got to Clay County first, and that's why there aren't many people with Irish heritage that are born here. Iowa as a whole was a Protestant state. In the 1800s, it was a 10-to-1 ratio, right? For every 10 Protestants, there was 1 Catholic person. But somehow there were still a lot of Irish Catholics seemingly everywhere. Just because they weren't in a large population doesn't mean they weren't here. The KKK played a large part in this too, in the 20s and 30s, because they were anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. And so while they didn't like the Irish immigrants that were here, there really isn't a lot of record of violence or disruptive acts against immigrants, which I think is kind of odd that it wasn't ever recorded in a newspaper or anything like that the KKK attacked an Irish immigrant that was Catholic. So that being said, while there was that, they didn't get along, they also seemed to stay away from each other, which is kind of odd. They kind of just respected their own space. That doesn't mean that they didn't cross paths, but there still wasn't a lot of violence like you would see in cities being fought between the 2 religious groups. These religious groups also carried over into politics. So Protestants at the time were largely Republican, and Catholics were Democrat. So if you were Irish, you were probably a Democrat. And depending on where you lived, if you were the majority, you worked the service jobs. So in the small towns like Emmitsburg, where the population was majority Irish Catholic, most of the public service jobs, like mayor, they were Catholics as well. And then that rang true in Protestant towns as well. And they disagreed on really 2 main things were voting restrictions and prohibition. And they also disagreed on Herbert Hoover when he was running for presidency. He was largely supported by the Protestant community in Iowa, which was most of the state. It was 90% of the state, essentially, while his opponent was supported by Irish Catholics. However, when he won candidacy and became president, the Irish Catholics here in Iowa supported him, and they thought he would do well. They were excited to see what he would accomplish as president. So I don't know if I think that has to just do with him being from Iowa, because that really wasn't a trend elsewhere. But yeah, they were excited to have an Iowan as president, even though they didn't vote for him. And then there are some famous Irish Iowans. They aren't really famous for being Irish, but they're from Iowa. So we have the Sullivan brothers. I don't know how much you guys know about them. I see a lot of head nods. So the 5 Sullivan brothers served together in the Navy during World War II. When they were enlisted, their one request was that they served together, and so they were all on the same boat. That means that they all sadly died together as well. There's a story of their mom their mom that when the Navy officer was coming up, she knew that something bad had happened. And so she asked him which one had died. And he responded, "I'm sorry, all of them." And so that's a very tragic story. And it kind of became a rallying point for U.S. citizens about World War II and like getting the war over with. Their story was made into a movie in 1944. So their legacy still lives on. Then we have John Mulroney. I wouldn't say he's really famous, but he's a good success story of an Irish immigrant in Iowa. So he actually came to the United States when he was 13. He moved to New York City. And then he decided to follow everybody and do the gold rush in California. And that worked out really well for him. He came to Iowa and then settled in Palo Alto County, where he had a ranch farm for like 8 years. And he spent his wealth here, so he decided that Iowa was a good place to retire. And then he ended up moving to Fort Dodge, actually working for the railroad companies. So he's a good success story of an Irish immigrant who chose Iowa ultimately. And then we have Kate Shelley. Her father worked for the railroad company. He ended up being one of those people that bought land from the railroad company, and they settled near Boone, and so they had their family farm. Her father sadly passed away shortly after, so it was just her mother, and her siblings. When she was 17, this would have been in 1881, they were living on their farm, and she was very familiar with the railroad because of her father. There was a big storm that came in, and she was really worried that a bridge had gone out for the train. And she went and she could see that nobody was at like the train station checking. There was no lights or anything. So she went and followed the tracks to where the bridge was supposed to be on Honey Creek is what it was. And that bridge had given out. There wasn't anything there for the train to follow anymore. So if the train got there, it would have crashed. So she ended up crawling on her hands and knees across other bridges to get to like a train station further up that could stop the train before midnight. So she crawled basically all night long to this other outpost, and she was able to get the train stopped in time before it hit to this bridge that was out. So she kind of became a nationwide hero at the time. A lot of different communities awarded her with money or her family with goods. The railroad company itself, which had been the one that her father worked for, actually provided her a scholarship so she could go on to college and get an education, which was very not normal at the time for a woman. So she was very thankful for her father having been a railroad worker, and that kind of relationship between the workers and the railroads did exist, and it worked out.
Did she stay in Iowa?
I believe so. I can't remember. She went to school, I want to say she went to St. Ambrose, but I'm not sure. But yeah, I know she stayed in Iowa. And the museum in Boone has the lantern she used when she was crawling, so you can go see that if you want. All right, and kind of the legacy of Irish immigrants in Iowa. The Potato Famine, we still talk about it. The Des Moines Register did a 150th anniversary on it because it was such a big deal, and it's a reason why there are people here in Iowa. And so it's a legacy. It's something I don't think we're going to forget anytime soon. And then St. Ambrose University was established through the Catholic Church, and they are believed to have the largest Irish collection in the Midwest, which is kind of awesome because we don't have a lot here. You would think it'd be in a larger city like Chicago or something, so it's cool that it's in a smaller community. And then St. Patrick's Day, I heard a lot of you talking beforehand about going to Emmitsburg to see the parade. So St. Patrick's Day goes all the way back to the 1860s in Iowa. That's kind of the first record of Iowans celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And we still, in the Midwest in general, a lot of communities really do go big and have a celebration, and everyone does still wear green, even if you aren't Irish. So it's just kind of this legacy that we still have and an impact from Irish immigrants. So if you guys have any questions about the Irish, then I might be able to answer. One thing I didn't really talk about is Ireland's seeking freedom from the British Empire and how that played out here. Irish in America and Iowa were vehement supporters of it. They were collecting money, having rallies, anything they could to support trying to free Ireland.
There was just an Oscar-nominated movie called Dublin that tells the 20th century story of the struggle, but that's been going on since the 1600s. So.
Yeah.
That movie was showing up the street here last Monday night, and it was just really fun.
It's a great movie.
And the Catholics and the Protestants were fighting each other, and the Catholics were getting the worst of it, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But well, they didn't, you know, when you hear Irish people talk, you'll enjoy their speaking. We didn't hear that in that movie.
You explained it very well, how that the Iowa played an integral part in bringing the immigrants up from Mississippi to Iowa. But I wonder why that when they came in through Ellis Island or down through Maine, they came all the way to Iowa, because there's a lot of land here and there.
A lot of it had to do with the same kind of push and pull factors that were happening in Ireland. When they got to Boston or Philadelphia or New York, they were still facing like religious persecution. They had so many competition for work, so they were still poor and hungry. And even in bigger cities, Iowa was being advertised. Iowa was being advertised as kind of like this promised land where you could come and make money and build a good life for your family. So it was kind of the same as what was happening in Ireland. And same thing, religious leaders were also telling them to come this way, because a lot of the religious leaders themselves would end up in the cities. And then those in Iowa wanted to make more parishes and spread, so they would have them come for the bigger cities and kind of fill in those gaps.
Well, you can go to Dubuque and you can see homes that look like the one that we have on Grand, the big estate. And you go in the basement and they still have boarded up tunnels that would go into the mines.
The mines,
you know.
yeah.
And these people that owned the mines had these big, but that's where they mined, was out of the basements of their homes eventually became. And there's still a lot of rattlesnakes there.
Oh, lovely.
Like that a lot.
Mom, there's a snake down there.
One of the, you talk about push-pull, one of the land pushes in Ireland was imposed by the British, and that was inheritance. For instance, if you had 4 kids, sons or daughters, in Ireland it didn't matter. 4 sons, you could not leave the entire lump to one of those kids. It had to be divided equally. So over time, 200 acres would become postage stamp because kids having kids, that legacy was imposed, that you could not have the land intact within a family. It was a push out, essentially.
But then the British got it back because in the 1800s, all those giant estates, they couldn't support them anymore. So they would burn those giant, big, beautiful places like you see in Downton Abbey. They would just burn them because they didn't have people to work them anymore. And you think, how could people burn, you know, those giant, beautiful homes and land? But
There's an interesting guy that has no tie to Iowa because he immigrated west and on the railroad through southern Minnesota, but he had effect on the immigration. His name is Thomas. Thomas is pronounced Marr, spelled M-E-A-G-H-E-R, Marr. He was the son of an Irish Parliament person. He came to this country because there were so many Irish coming, but the New York scenario, not the New Orleans enough thing. But when the Civil War rolled around, he felt that a way to be accepted in this country was to join the cause, and it was for the North. And he put together the 48th and another one, whose number I can't remember, but the encouragement was join up. New York was doing something really cute during the Civil War. You could you could pay somebody to take your place and fight. So that was, he used that as a hang your hat on it. $300, I believe. You've said 500 in previous, but I've read 300 to be killed for the cause. And he put together these regiments, and as the war rolled on and attrition occurred, it was open to Irish and freed blacks. And as a result of service, if you lived through it, you could apply for homestead, and so there'd probably some tie to Iowa, because homesteading, if you were a Civil War veteran, the amount of time you spent in service was taken off the 5 years that it would take to get your land free and clear. So there's a bit of a jump. But this guy literally solicited his his fellow countrymen to join the cause. Here's the good reasons, and you know, at the end you might come out with something.
Yeah, the being awarded land in not just Iowa, but like kind of the whole upper Midwest. Yeah, that happened not just to Iowans, but like everybody in the country.
right, and during the Mexican-American War,
Same thing.
there was an Irish infantry division that went to Mexico because they believed in they left the American troops and went to Mexico. And there's a whole, well, Mexico has a lot of immigrants as well, like us, but they, like Anthony Quinn, the actor, that was his ancestors that went to that. But you never think of Irish people in Mexico, but you know, that would have been unprecedented for an American troops to say, we're leaving you guys, we're going to go fight for Mexico.
Sure.
Well, there are a lot of Catholic colleges in Dubuque and Davenport.
And that's because that's where they ended up. Yeah.
Mother Mary Frances Clark was invited by Bishop Flores to found a school, and that's Clark, now Clark University. Do you know St. Ambrose's dates for starting?
Not off the top of my head.
Clark was 1843.
Yeah, I'm not.
And you have a graduate of Clark?
Yes. So we're defensive about it.
I'm pretty sure it was after. Yeah.
Well, in so many places, the Catholics went to the res too, and the nuns and the priests, you know, manned the schools. Like in Winnebago, St. Augustine's still exists and helps kids. So
That was something I don't think I mentioned either. Part of their success in like rural communities especially is that they were able to create like their own school systems and support each other. You know, they bought from other Irish Catholics because that's all there was, for one.
Well, in Iowa also, you probably came across this, I believe it was Davenport, 1877. A gentleman took exception to all these the teachers that were, and the schools that were Irish. So that was the birthplace of the American Protective Association.
Yes, I did read a little bit about that. Yes.
What a darn campus.
Which that kind of ties in with like the KKK. There were these movements that were anti-immigrant or anti-Catholic specifically. They didn't necessarily last that long. They did end up dying out, which I think is interesting. That's true. That's true. But the activity that you would have seen, you know, in the 20s compared to today is very different. And I think that's interesting. And then the American Protective Association, is that what it's called?
Yes.
That became a nationwide thing, but that also eventually died out.
Irish Benevolent Society?
American Protective Association. And it was specifically to combat the fact that there was such a high percentage of Irish with not only teaching positions, but their own schools. You know, the Pope was gonna come over and
Take over.
take over, yeah, exactly. No, it was the Catholics were viewed as anti-American. So that's what we did, apparently.
Yeah.
Heaven forbid.
Exactly.
Well, when the Irish came to New York, a lot of them became police officers. Now, was that true when they came to Iowa? Or did they go into law enforcement?
I do not know. My guess would be in certain communities probably that's a public service job. So I guess that would be true in predominantly Catholic or Irish Catholic communities.
I always enjoy listening to the Irish speak. They for the black seven, the way they speak, it's quite interesting. I don't know how long they keep it, but
There are certain counties in Ireland that their schools are in Gaelic, Irish Gaelic.
Mm-hmm.
And I just read yesterday that there's a school that's more for adults, and it's like enrichment, like doing this or whatever, only it's a period of time. And it's to learn and converse and read in Irish Gaelic. And it started out with 5 people, and now it's several hundred that are attending the thing. The Irish Catholic Ghetto thing.
Hey, explain to me, I have friends from Ireland, and they'll always talk about Black Irish.
Yes,
What does that mean?
the dark Irish. Do they call it the Black Irish?
Yeah.
Well,
from Spain?
as I understand it, no. The Roman Empire, that preceded the British, of course. They had taken over the land that we know as Ireland and intermarried. So the Celts, on the other hand, were blue-eyed and blonde. So if you're I've always heard it as dark Irish, but Black Irish, same way. Dark eyes, dark hair. And you'll find that families have, they'll have a skew. If there are many kids, you'll have blonde, blue-eyed, and brown, dark hair.
it's not Negroid then.
No.
No, but I always wondered what that meant.
It's the Italian, actually,
Influence.
the Roman Empire conquest.
You wouldn't count. I'd come closer than you would.
Well, I'm red haired.
I wouldn't have known that.
So this is great. I'm not the expert on this, so I really like when you guys have some input and discussions. I only researched this for like a few weeks, so I don't know everything by any means.
There weren't any redheads in Ireland or Scotland until Ivan the Viking came over to conquer the land, and when he left, there were a lot of redheads left behind.
It just sprung up
History's
like
arguments had a good
bad potatoes. Huh?
And so I did want to share that most of my research did come from the Irish Iowa book. It came out in like 2018, 2019. It's like $18 on Amazon if you're interested in it. Yeah, it's pretty thorough, and they have it kind of divided into topics. So if you want to know more specific names or about dates and things that I didn't talk about, you can pick this up. It's not at the Spencer Library as far as I know, because I did try and get it from the library, but.
Do you know if the Irish came to work at John Deere? I know a lot of Swedes did.
I do not know. Yeah.
You're talking about, Merlin was talking about accents and how the Irish speak. A lot of people took teaching jobs, women particularly. It was either house, domestic, whatever, or teaching because they spoke English and they could teach other immigrants who weren't English speaking to speak. And if you look at linguistic history, the folks that you know, have the, what you call a New York accent, that's the D's and the M's and the Do's. That's because they, at some point, there were Irish teachers intervening, because the Irish do not pronounce TH. It's "that" instead of that. And the Brooklyn East, the, you know, the old-time New Yorker that isn't ready for prime time in present day, that's the origin of the dialect, the Irish. Shame on them, teaching them pronunciation.
A lot of single Irish women, they taught or they worked as domestic servants to stay single too, because that's not something they could do in Ireland. So they would stay single a lot longer than they would have otherwise, which I thought was interesting, just because they could be independent here. I thought that was cool, that was a trend. Something like, I can't remember which, if it was Dubuque or Burlington, but one of them, when one of their census in the 1860s, I think, there were twice as many single women, Irish women, as there were Irish men that were single, that's crazy to me.
But it's kind of strange that so many Irish went to Dubuque when it's named after Frenchmen.
Labor.
St. Ambrose was founded in 1882. It was a seminary and business school.
There we go.
Where is it?
Where is it located?
Davenport.
Oh, okay. My mom had a friend who talked about immigration. She was in Auschwitz during the war, she and her husband, and she's portrayed in the Schindler's List. If you remember the lady who did the Gestapo's clothing and her husband, that's her. And she was my mom's good buddy in Florida. And when she heard I was moving to Iowa, she said, "Oh, I love Iowa." And I said, "Why do you love Iowa?" And she said, "Because that's where they repatriated them." And her husband worked of all places, what you were talking about in, not Wellington, it's another W town in southern Iowa. It's where the,
Williamsburg.
no, I'll remember in a second, but because she also pronounced that with a V. And it's the name is escaping me, but it's where they have the big, oh God, somebody was mentioning it here, big green trucks and the big,
John Deere.
John Deere. It's where John Deere's headquarters was.
That's Moline,
Well,
Moline, Illinois.
but there's a big presence.
No, in Waterloo. Waterloo, that's how, because everything with a W was a V with her. But she was amazing, and that generation, my mom's still alive, she can be 97, and that generation did not talk about the Holocaust. But this generation does. I asked her every question, she was so fascinating, you know.
If you go to Dubuque, there's a Wahlert Memorial Library on the Loras College campus. There's Wahlert High School. There's several other things. The Wahlert family, pre-World War II, between the two wars when the Nazis were taking over, were repatriated just because they needed and wanted to get out. And as not only did they convert to Catholicism, but they have been more than, the family, even present day, has been more than generous with stuff that was needed by the city of Dubuque, that kind of thing.
Yeah, what would we be? We're a nation of immigrants. And when I hear these people saying, I always say, "Are you Native American?" You know, when you hear people
Yeah.
commenting about these immigrants,
Yeah.
I say, "Are you Native American?" We're all immigrants.
That's right, absolutely. Ireland, if you are first generation, or if you were born in Ireland, came to this country and want to go back, now that things are better, that it's more sensible in terms of activity for for fun and profit. You can apply for citizenship. This country does not permit dual citizenship, but Ireland does. So you do not have to renounce your U.S. citizenship. You can go over as a
Germany is that way too.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I had relatives that escaped the Holocaust, and they went to Cuba, they went to Ireland, to Dublin. I have cousins in Dublin, and one became the Lord Mayor of Dublin,
Wow.
like about 20 years ago. So when we went to visit there, it was like, I never thought of Dublin as having a Jewish ghetto. They have a Jewish ghetto there.
You think they would have learned.
Yeah.
Everybody's the same.
Well, it's not really a ghetto,
Yeah.
but an area.
All right. Before we run completely out of time, I think we're still on track. There are note cards and some pencils on the tables. One of the things I'm doing with these lunch and learns is hoping that it kind of sparks what your idea of your community is. So if you can, on one side, finish the statement my community shares. And at the end of the year, I'm going to compile all of these into like a word chart, and we'll see what people say. We're all done. A couple things coming up just for Clay County Heritage. We have a new exhibit opening next week about the American flag and how it became the flag that it is today, including like the materials on it and the number of stripes and stars and how all that works. And there's a lot of things to read there, so you can spend a lot of time in there. And then we also have a tea party coming up Mother's Day weekend on May 7th, that's Saturday. And so those tickets are for sale too. So you guys are more than welcome to come up and see the glass potato close up so you can tell that it's a potato. But that is it for today.